So welcome everybody. This is a super salon on Interintellect with my friend Renée DiResta. We'll talk a little bit about contagion, I would say. I felt as I was reading your book, Invisible Rulers, the people who turn lies into reality, that another fitting title would have been Contagion. I know that after the pandemic, the movie Contagion, or during the pandemic, it kind of enjoyed a renaissance and everybody watched Kate Winslet die without a blanket. But still, this book, like the movie, is about contagion. And you talk about social contagion, which is one of the most interesting phenomena in mankind, in mankind's history. And on the internet, we kind of see it from the front row at unprecedented scales, but also physical contagion and how these two things interact, and how some of the worst instincts humans have about social contagion actually come out in these high-risk health-related life and death questions. So welcome, Renée. First of all, how are you doing, and how does it feel to have published this book, and what has been what have been the most common questions so far that you've been getting?
Well, it feels good to be done with it. That's for sure. It took a little over a year, so I think that's pretty common though. It was my first time writing a trade press book, so trying to figure out how to balance between giving information and then telling a story was kind of an interesting learning experience for me. And then as far as common questions, they've really run the gamut. Everybody has their own take because it resonates with something in their life. So, so I've had political questions. I've had people want to talk about COVID. I've had people want to talk about the drama at Stanford, the bullshit from the Substackers, like all sorts of different aspects of it have been, what people have gone to as it's most relevant to their own lives. So I think everyone has an experience of either having one of these, what are we doing moments on the internet, or getting sucked into, like the online rumor of the day, the online kind of gossip mail of the day, and or has had a family member maybe go and become part of kind of like feel increasingly unreachable. Maybe they become very far left, maybe they become very far right, but they feel like they can no longer have a conversation. So lots of ways in which people have found connections to their own life, which is really gratifying.
It's a bit of a Rorschach test in this really heated political moment, right? When we have so much on our minds, and we are all kind of, we all have access to the same kind of bundle of unease, but from a different angle. And we're taking different parts of it. And that's what I love about these conversations. We kind of can compare notes and say, okay, so the part that you are observing and the part that I'm observing, are they really the same thing? And so often they are.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I mean, on the flip side, when I was writing the book, I remember during COVID, I was in this very politically diverse group chat, and it was a really interesting experience because I felt like everybody kind of mutually survived 2020, and there was still general goodwill. And then the vaccines happened, and then even in that group, I will say, like, it was, most of the people were still very on board and got vaccinated quickly. That wasn't really a big point of discussion. But what you did start to see was people would share articles like into the chat, right, the group chat. And I remember once, like, one of the members in it, like, yelling at me, like, "You're a mom. How are you not outraged about this? Why don't I ever see you posting about this?" As if I was being some sort of like center left partisan for not weighing in on this outrage of the day. And I had to explain, like, I literally never see this. It never hits my radar. It is not in my feed. Nobody I know is actually mad about this. They're not even not mad about it. They're just not talking about it. They just don't care. It's not even on their radar. And so trying to explain that that dynamic of living in kind of very different worlds online, depending on which communities you found yourself in, and how it wasn't necessarily a reflection of even what people thought. Like, it wasn't even a conscious desire to offend or not participate. It was just that it wasn't even on the radar.
In 2017, early 2017, like during the Zuckerberg congressional hearings, I hosted a debate in London. This was like way before Interintellect, but somehow Interintellect was already kind of being born at the time. And as one of the exercises that I subjected my audience to was to use AirParrot and basically project your phone screen on the wall. And I just asked people to open Facebook at the time everybody used Facebook on your phone and show your timeline. And this was an election year. I think Theresa May or some big scandal was undergoing, we were undergoing at the time. And I saw on people's faces that this was the first time that they actually saw that their timeline is, there's no the timeline that you are being toyed with. And this is like very similar interests, Shoreditch in London, people who would go to such an event in such a location, so already extremely filtered. And even for us, it was night and day. And there you can, I only found out about the baby hippopotamus yesterday. I feel like, yeah, but by the time you find out, it doesn't matter, you know? And I'm saying this sitting literally next to this little thing here. So some memes do survive. But I don't know if the Moondanger, what's its name, will. What do you think? Do you think that the pandemic had this very, very similar parallel timeline situation, or was that indeed a moment of unity where at least for 1 second humanity paid attention to the same thing?
I think at a conceptual level, yes. Like I remember we were paying attention to it pretty early at Stanford for a couple of reasons. One, I was traveling a lot, and I was I'm friendly with Balaji, and he sent me a text, and he's like, "How are you still going to DC? How are you flying San Francisco to DC?" This was like December, and he's like, "You're insane. You shouldn't do this. If you do it, you should wear a mask." And I remember going and thinking like, nobody's wearing a mask on this flight. There's like 3 members of Congress in the front row. It was like the shuttle bus, basically San Francisco to DC. All the members go back, and trying to decide like, whether this was actually a huge deal or not. And it still felt a little bit unpredictable. And I was trying to decide whether he was paranoid or whether I was not sufficiently concerned. So for me, it was like those conversations started somewhat early, just in the friend group. And then at work, we were looking at what China was doing. And we had started looking at what China was doing actually even a little bit earlier. And we were
Stanford Internet Laboratory. If anybody doesn't know, Renée's, hey, that's your mothership.
Yes, exactly. So I was right, exactly. That was my little DCSF shuttle going back and forth. But no, we were looking at Chinese state media propaganda, and so we were watching the sort of creation of this alternate universe that they were trying to spin there. They were really trying to reassure people. They were building hospitals in like 4 days. They were trumpeting their ability to do this. Like, just truly wild to watch that stuff now. So I think everybody was kind of on the same page. Like when the first cases appeared in the US, there was still that, well, we're all in this together. Okay, this is going to be awkward. There was, remember that whole like stay home for 2 weeks kind of thing. And then it wound up being a whole lot longer than 2 weeks. And so I think in the beginning you had that unity, but then gradually that really started to disintegrate. And then it really became very much a focus on what platforms you were on, who you paid attention to, and who you trusted. And you started to see that get very divided. And then obviously concurrently there was the election, which was also sort of inherently partisan. So you had that double wave of people then experiencing the Trump Biden campaign through very partisan lenses. And social media oftentimes will shift to be more kind of partisan, and just in terms of what people are talking about, what content the feed has to pull from, like during election seasons. So yeah, so it started off, I mean, it's too bad, right? It could have had potential as a thing to really bring people together, but I think the incentives are just not there.
We have so many opportunities as humans to come together, and so many will end up being missed. Tell us a little bit about the Stanford Internet Observatory. I mean, for those people, I mean, a lot of people are familiar with it, but sometimes, there are these incredible organizations operating in the background, producing works, research, intellectuals, trade books, and people don't even know what, the man hours that go into it.
Yeah, so SIF started in 2019, and it was a we can talk about that. It was a center to study adversarial abuse online. So basically, when a new technology emerges or a new platform emerges, there is a kind of realignment as far as how people use the internet, and that includes adversarial people. So that might be spammers, scammers, kind of directly manipulative types of actors. State propagandists was a big one. And so we would do research projects looking at the dynamics of adversarial abuse. So so the kinds of stuff that falls into like trust and safety at a tech platform. X just released its transparency report today. You can see them sort of break down things by category, like different types of harms and things that platforms pay attention to. That's the kind of stuff that we paid attention to also. And my work specifically focused mostly on state actors, mostly on propaganda and influence. That was the bulk of my stuff there. But a big part of the trust and safety work, and for me over the last year, big part of my work was actually on child safety. So looking at how children experience online harms or are, incorporated into particularly harmful content. So it was again a study, and I'm down here in Charlottesville today to go present on kind of AI generated non-consensual imagery and AI generated scams. So the work continues even though I'm not at SIO anymore.
Are you in therapy? Like this must be super hard to look at stuff. I just watched in New York the play Job, the Frantic play. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's about somebody like you, the heroine, and it's her therapy session where they try to kind of analyze what it feels like to be looking at stuff that you are trying to have nobody to look at.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sorry, I thought you meant about like not being at SIO anymore. And I was like, no, I
Oh no!
don't really care.
What yoga will do for that.
Is. I mean, I'm pissed about it, but it's not like it's not like it leaves me sad at night. No, I think I've been doing this for a long time now. And one thing that I think you find in people who do trust and safety work is there's a very, very strong sense of mission, right? And that you're able to do something that is incredibly impactful and incredibly helpful. And so I think it is a a form of work where the sort of satisfaction of doing it keeps people doing it. The child safety stuff is tough. We build all sorts of different protections into the work streams to make sure that people don't see things actually that increasingly, and this is actually one of the nice things about AI from a positive standpoint, that things like machines will eventually be able to see these things so that human moderators don't have to. So we're not doing like the work of frontline content moderators or anything like that. That those people really wind up, needing therapy quite quickly, unfortunately. But a lot of the work that we do is trying to look at what sorts of policies and things can make that work less awful.
Working on something as essential and important for the safety of families, minors, generally the internet as a space, as child safety. Why do you think your work is so controversial? Is it related? Is it the Stanford Internet Laboratory that is controversial, or is it you personally? It seems like, talk about mission, right, and cleaning things up, you guys are rustling some feathers. Why is that?
Well, I mean, so some of the work that we do looks at elections, right? Looks at, and globally, not only in the US, but globally. Whenever you weigh in, even if it's just to say, hey, look at this over here, or to say, hey, these policies don't seem to be serving us well, or to say, hey, these accounts are directly manipulative, you are, if you believe that social media is a tool of power, which I do, and that all sorts of different actors use it, both legitimate and illegitimate, meaning like both authentic, I should say authentic and inauthentic, are using it to obtain or maintain power, then if you're seen as doing work that in some way interferes with that or makes it harder to do or what have you, then it's not surprising when you get attacked or by the people who see you as inconveniencing them. And a lot of the focus on our work over the last year, particularly our work on elections, was instigated by, for example, members of Congress who voted not to certify the election, by state attorneys general who filed amicus briefs to overturn votes in other states, right? By by Stephen Miller, right? I mean, no bigger badge of honor than being sued by Stephen Miller, because like, fuck that guy. And that, I think, is where you do get at this, this question of when you do work that is politically, where people see it as somehow like impinging on their power, or where they can spin it as impinging on their power, then you do become a a villain in a cinematic universe. And so it becomes, I think, challenging to separate the institution's work, the broader mission, my work, what I've done over the actual things that I say, versus the caricatures and the sort of smear campaigns that become helpful um, to political actors who see attacking us or our work as politically advantageous for them. I mean, we're not doing rapid response election work in 2024, right? And so, to that extent, they won, and that, I think, is it's moral cowardice on Stanford's part, in my opinion. But it is the smear campaigns do eventually drive people out of doing particular types of work, and that is what happened with the Internet Observatory's case.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. And I'm sure this is just the end of Act 1 in a 3-act movie. But that must be a bummer. And, we do kind of common knowledge related salons. And when we talk about, surprise hangings and other delicacies from game theory, and how, it is possible to raise the price of dissent. You can, target people as individuals who have families and lives, and at some point, anybody who is not a complete, I don't know, saint will start prioritizing other elements of safety and might back down. But it's really interesting to me that sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I totally agree. I think that's where, this has always been where that trade-off is on social platforms between maximal free expression and recognizing that free expression can sometimes be used to stifle freedom of assembly, if you will, right? That by just sort of attacking people to push them out of a conversation, by casting that as some sort of, free speech right on a private platform, you do wind up shifting the user base in particular directions if that kind of behavior is just allowed to proliferate unchecked. You create a perverse incentive where the person most willing to harass their enemies out of the conversation advantages themselves in the conversation. And these are the sorts of things that we just need to recognize when you're dealing with particular online infrastructures. It's that is, in a sense, the trade-off, right? How do you strike that balance?
I love I don't know if you guys are familiar with this old Scott Alexander, RIP Culture War piece, which basically talks about this, right? Like the most foul-mouthed Redditors, the biggest trolls, have the most time, seemingly, important pieces of information and motivation to peddle their stuff. And you, the innocent, the one in the right, might just not have enough time because you have to pick up your kids or go to work to continue arguing with them. The book itself is titled Invisible Rulers, but it has a motivation, as far as I can tell, to make them very visible. What was the most surprising toe that you felt you stepped on? What was the most surprising toe that you stepped on that you are still happy to talk about?
I didn't want to pull punches in the book. I mean, if anything, it was the 6 rounds of legal review that that were going to pull the punches. But no, I wanted to write something that that explained, from my perspective, from the work I've done over the last decade, what big shifts have happened. And again, it's not that propaganda is new or that influence is new. I just wanted to explain how it works today, and I wanted to do it kind of as clearly as possible. But I also wanted to connect it back to history, right? We are not, we didn't just emerge. Like, the internet is not the first mass communication medium. It's not the first person-to-person communication medium. So trying to explain rumors and propaganda in the context of history was important to me. And then telling the specific stories, right? So the first half of the book third of the book is explaining the framework, right? How does this work today? How does propaganda work? What, an invisible ruler is a phrase from Edward Bernays' book in 1929, Propaganda. And he's describing invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions, these sort of opinion shapers that he's describing. And I wanted to talk about what opinion shapers were today. And one of the reasons they're invisible is that you often don't recognize them as being opinion shapers. There's just a feeling that this is just kind of conversational. You don't realize how influential certain figures actually are in public discourse. And so my goal with the book was to try to just explain that. The second half of the book really then goes into like the specific kind of case studies where I think it's like relevant, or the specific topics where I think it's relevant. So like using the story of the election to explain why so many people, why 30% of Americans continue to believe the election was stolen, right? It's a staggering number, actually. And whenever you hear the disinformation has no impact, I'm like, great, but you know, people showed up to the Capitol and took action. People, when polled, continue to express this belief, right? There's no cost to politicians who express it. In fact, there's benefit from, from large numbers of people. This question of how do we think about that going forward? What are these types of divides mean for us, for our ability to reach consensus on any topic? And then the chapter on COVID tried to get into where institutions failed, right? Where the sort of old guard did not exactly cover itself in glory as it struggled with how to interact in a real-time viral participatory media ecosystem. And for me, of course, at the time, as I was writing it, I'd just gotten the Jim Jordan subpoenas and all the nonsense with the Substackers. And so I decided I was going to write about it. Like, the sheer process by which people come to form beliefs about me and my work, which is very, very small. Like most people in the world are not paying attention to me, right? It's just but for the ones who do, like, my God, do they have strong opinions? And so I wanted to, to kind of like walk the reader through how that, in my opinion, like quite manipulative process had actually happened, and why the incentives of the people who were, talking about my work and saying that I ran some mass censorship cabal that censored 22 million tweets, which was complete bullshit. Like where those claims came from and how they were sort of laundered into the media ecosystem of people who wanted to believe them, frankly, and then members of Congress who found them advantageous as a thing to cite. So it was a very weird year as far as this.
So powerful, Renée. I had no idea. Wow. You just like single-handedly, you deleted half of Twitter.
I know, just millions and millions of tweets. I mean, it's just complete bullshit. It's the weirdest thing. You can go look at the transparency reports. You would theoretically see that in there somewhere. But no, or you could, again, the people who ran the so-called Twitter files had access to all these emails, and yet no emails have emerged in which we are requesting that Twitter go and censor, 1 million tweets, let alone 22 million tweets, let alone even like 10,000 tweets. I mean, we're just in this universe of made up large numbers. But if you're gonna recast yourself as a valiant hero on your Substack, slaying the people who, the villains who ran quote unquote mass censorship cabals, well, then you've got to make sure that there's a cabal out there somewhere. Otherwise, your hero arc is going to be quite short. And so what you see is just this constant, this sort of constant moving of the goalposts and changing of the narrative. And there's never any acknowledgement of how completely wrong they actually were about this.
We have a question in the chat from Gina. How do you analyze the difference between offensive versus defensive manipulation? I'm thinking when companies are using practices to protect against other companies rather than targeting citizens.
So that's an interesting question. I'm trying to, I'm reading it now. Sorry if I hope I'm still on camera. I'm thinking, okay. So the offensive versus defensive manipulation. So usually when we're talking about offensive actions, it's the so first of all, there's a couple things I would say there. One, when it comes to state actors, for example, it's kind of table stakes at this point. Like they're all doing offensive action. Even the US government runs propaganda campaigns on social media at this point. So we do see just a lot of entities that are willing to do it, whereas defensive, most of the time you're not actually running counter manipulation. You're trying to think about like what kind of design changes would maybe disincentivize a certain type of behavior, or what kind of policies do you put in place to deal with the behavior if it persists despite incentives. So like Facebook's integrity teams continuing to constantly be vigilant to take down, I think in the last month we've heard about Russian networks, we've heard about Iranian networks. I think we get Chinese every now and then pretty constantly. So you see the defensive is really happening in different terms, in more policy and design and moderation terms, as opposed to people running countermeasures. I'm not sure if that's what you mean though.
Did it cover your question, Gina? That helps. All right. I feel like there's something whenever we probe the truth and the incentives of the internet that really probe at the core of it. I mean, I'm as an elderly millennial, I was there when Wikipedia was born, I was there when Creative Commons was born, and we saw the idealism and then we saw the reality that followed. And I feel like, and there must be a reason why, millennials have this added obsession with truth on the internet, because we're dealing with the loss of a dream, but also we sense that there would be a way to salvage it, that this is not fully lost. It's just the first round of, I'm sure Stuart Brand feels the same way about some of his projects, right? Like you have this theoretical, idealistic, poetic, youthful way of hoping what it would become. And then come the other people with their own agendas, with their own abuse of the tools that you built for them. And then there has to be a kind of Hegelian synthesis where we sit down and we say, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is something there that we were right about, right? You mentioned Substack. There are so many tools where we can arrive at the truth together faster and better than we would have through established media outlets in the 1950s. But there is also this underbelly, the kind of collective, not even subconscious, but unconscious, our id, that is there constantly pulling us down. And so one of the questions that would arise here for me is, are we really becoming more extreme on the internet, or is it just or we just gave extremization a louder mic?
No, there actually is a lot more, within the United States. Like it's a matter of polarization that happens as people get more and more entrenched in their particular identities. And one of the reasons that happens is potentially counterintuitively because they can see everybody else's. And so one of the things that you see come up pretty regularly in like social science research is people who find that the reason group A doesn't like group B happens in part because group A sees all of group B's things. It's not that they're in an echo chamber where they don't see it. And so they become, radicalized by only seeing the same thing all the time. Like that happens, but it's in much, much smaller cases. Or smaller numbers of cases. In this particular like dynamic though, what you're seeing is, a Democrat woman sees people saying mean things about Democrats and feels like, well, I have to defend myself and my point of view. So then, people will get better and better at kind of counter trolling or attacking other people. They'll form little, like the book, and I use the word factions in the book, right? Where like actively kind of attacking the other people is it becomes a norm, right? It's a real norm shift in just how we've chosen to engage. The sorts of things that you would never do in an actual public square, right? I mean, like you're in Union Square in New York, how many people are going to like follow one guy around screaming, right? or do something where they like show up to somebody's house and and harass them, right? Like you just don't see that kind of behavior happen in real world public squares, and that's because there's pretty clear norms. But also, if you need to, there's also some time, place, and manner restrictions that say like, no, you can't you can't harass people in these ways on the street. So there's all sorts of different mechanisms where when you look online, just the dynamics of how we engage is very different. So yes, it's visibility, but the visibility reinforces it. The visibility like helps shape the norm. And then once the norm is established, you see it happen more and more. And so it's not as simple as giving a voice only to people who were doing it before. It's that that kind of behavior is seen as like, this is just how you engage. This is just what you do. I don't know if you spend time like on any of the sort of platforms that emerged after Elon bought Twitter and people on the left got dissatisfied with like the direction he took things. You would see people who would behave in certain ways on other platforms, like Threads, we'll use that as an example. And other members of the community would react to seeing certain posts or certain types of content by being like, we don't do that here. Like, go back to Twitter. That's Twitter behavior. And I always thought it was kind of funny because it was just like it was people really just immediately trying to get to like, we don't want this space to be like that space, not because of who's here, but because we don't want those behaviors happening in the space. Like, we came here to get away from certain types of behavior, and we want to reinforce those norms. And you see this on Blue Sky, you see it on Mastodon. To some extent, you actually even see it on Truth Social and places like that, where communities are just trying to set their own like reset norms that they are happy with for how they're going to engage with each other.
I mean, Blue Sky had some problems at the beginning. I remember it had this kind of utopia when it was 100 users, and then came the boobs, and then the really extreme political stuff. And I was like, oh, okay. I guess we're not in Kansas anymore. Let's let's start muting people and blocking people as one does everywhere else. But the first 3 days were amazing, but I love this. I always say that one of the reasons why Interintellect tends to be very, very peaceful is because we're kind of recreating this experience of being at a dinner party. Like, what are you going to win by like misbehaving during an Interintellect series? Like, the host will kick you out and you will lose your money. You're not going to gain followers. You're not going to get a job at a far-right outlet or whatever people are using their Twitters for. But the Union Square thing is hilarious. I mean, I think the most accurate, kind of recreating Twitter on Union Square in New York would be like Renée and I were talking amongst ourselves about, I don't know, a trip to Italy. And then somebody comes and says, but what about Ukraine? Why are you not talking about Ukraine? And we would be like, yeah, that's just like not what we're talking about. We are having a relatively private conversation in a public space, and that's fine. Like, there's people can both care about something and not right now talk about it. It's completely allowed and possible. Jesse, you have your hand up. Thank you for politely waiting. The floor is now yours. I love this setup. You're a pro at this. Well, with my laptop stand.
I'm thankfully not moving at this moment, so I empathize. And a comment before a question, I find the concept or hashtag influencers in the wild as kind of proof that the internet culture is bleeding into the town square, especially with the MAGA types doing it as they would online. But I have a question for you, and it's kind of a two-parter. As a researcher, as someone who's on the front lines, what do you think we as a society are getting wrong about the narrative around this subject, right? Like the stories we tell about propaganda, the stories we tell about misinformation and internet online. What are we just wrong about? Like, what do you as a researcher just sort of laugh and go, oh, those guys don't get it? And then the second part,
like, what's the conspiracy theory of the conspiracy theory?
Right.
And the couple of the couple. It's a good question.
And what should the narrative be focused on? Like, what would you wish, right? If you got to program MSNBC for a week, right? What do you think they should be talking about to really get the political class talking about this stuff?
Yeah, so I love that question. It's funny. I'm down here at Charlottesville because I am going to this conference on AI and elections, and I have almost like a visceral annoyance anytime those two words are like put together these days. And it's because I did a bunch of work again on like generative AI starting in we had access to GPT-3 in 2020, and we had researcher access. A lot of times you get early sort of means of access, and the sort of deep fake dynamics have begun happening in 2018, 2019. That was when it became clear that the tech was going to progress pretty rapidly. And I felt like it was perfectly possible to have like a clear-eyed view of what was going to happen, which is that there would be impacts on trust. There would be kind of an adjustment period where people would no longer necessarily be able to feel like they could confidently trust what they see with their eyes or what they hear with their ears. It was pretty clear then also that audio and text were going to be more potentially impactful than video and images, even as media liked to focus on video and images in part because then they could like put out examples, right? So you could see the pictures of the AI generated faces and things. And but there was this thing that they missed, which was that just because propaganda exists in the world, just because you can create it, doesn't mean it's going to have an impact. And doesn't mean that it's going to mass persuade people, doesn't mean that it's going to destroy democracy, right? And so it was this we should be able to hold two ideas in our head. One, that this is a thing that we need to understand, take seriously, educate people, come up with policies and frameworks for it, that there's going to be some big adjustments to, the democratization of a very powerful new technology. And also, this was not the sort of thing where like the sky is falling and we have to be assuming that that our elections are going to be imminently overrun with AI generated propaganda. So I think one of the and that I feel is true actually of propaganda more broadly, which is just understanding like when it resonates and how and why. Or even I think another thing I'd like to see us do more of is just get comfortable with the word, right? With the recognition that this is actually a much more accurate description of what we're surrounded by than misinformation or disinformation even, which I tend to use mostly to refer to state actors or very deliberate campaigns. So I think it's that you can have this nuanced perspective. I got this funny do a debate about disinformation, like will it destroy democracy or is it a moral panic? And I was like, there's like a pretty big gulf between those two options, and it'd be nice if we could all like inhabit the gulf a little bit more, like just not everything has to be a binary where it has to be either a complete nothing burger or the worst thing ever. And I think social media really rewards those extremist positions. Like you don't get as much attention if you're not at one end of those highly opposite points.
I just had Claire Lehman, the founding editor of Quillette, on my podcast, The Hope Access. I always feel that we are, we started out at the same time, and Interact is doing very non-political stuff, and she's obviously doing very political stuff, but somehow deep down, we are driven by very similar ideals, and I wanted to explore that during the podcast. And we talked in one segment of the conversation about just like how does Quillette grow? Like where do people come to be reading it? And they have a relatively like intellectually diverse readership. And then she explained what they found out, having been this kind of like IDW scene players, what they found out about how Twitter works and how controversial you have to be on Twitter and how divisive if you want any eyeballs on your content. And it was very interesting how, as we were talking about our posts and how Interact started, how Quillette started, we both kind of reported this moment in like early 2019 when we first really felt the algorithm push us. And we both kind of independently of each other had the same thought, which was like, I'm not a prostitute. Like, can't push me for more followers, more selling out if I'm not morally and ideologically comfortable with this thing.
Right.
I think there's, for everyone who wants to be, in the public eye, there comes this moment where there's this devil's contract that you can sign with your blood. And then the algorithm will push you in one direction, left or right. Maybe these days, if you're pushed left, you will be pushed even onto another platform. But I think resisting that moment is almost like digital adulthood.
Yeah.
Like, I might, go in the West and diminish. I don't care. Or go into the West and diminish. But I'm not. And then some people can't. And it's just such a big temptation. And you see these influencers, right, who succumb basically to the expectations of their own audience and lose this orientation of what is left or right, even where is up and down. And I don't know, have you guys here, have you felt that? I mean, Renee, you must have felt it like 1,000 times, like you're right in the front lines there, but that's such an interesting moment when the algorithm finds you.
It's interesting because I think the one thing about being in academia, right? And I don't have a PhD, and I was only, my first academic job was the Stanford job, right? So it wasn't like I set
I
out
don't
to
have a PhD either. We have to have like a group therapy thing for this. This is such a disadvantage.
from like the, all of a sudden being in academia, but I did feel like there was like it was okay to be neutral, if that makes sense. Nobody, I think, like I actually preferred it, first of all, and because I do feel occasionally like another critique I would make of most fields is where the sort of personal political intersects, and it becomes like a little bit like too agenda driven. But the so I felt like I didn't have to make a choice. Like I didn't have to be stridently anything, and that was kind of nice actually, by virtue of just by being in academia versus being in media or commentary, right? Where I think you do feel that much more directly. This was always a thing where, I would talk to the founders of Substack periodically. We had them to Stanford a couple times for trust and safety and other conferences. And they would say, "Oh, well, we're resisting like the worst incentives of social media." And I always thought it was sort of like quaint because I think they really believe that. But I was like, no, 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 no. It's when it's like a patronage media model, it's even more direct, right? Then your livelihood is directly tied to what you put out. At least on social media, maybe you're just getting famous, but you have a little bit of like flexibility there because your Twitter posts are not directly paying your bills, or at least they weren't then.
We don't have illusions that interact. Like we know that at some point we will hit like a critical mass where it will become a problem, and that's
Yeah,
you
but
know
interesting case because there were
statistics. Like it's just the statistics. Also, it's just not just the incentives. It's also like the law of large numbers. Like you put enough people in the room, like some of them will be insane, right? Like they have to be.
I think IDW was very interesting to me because I remember, I've gone on Sam Harris a couple of times since COVID. I really like the community he's built, and I know he's substacking now, and his stuff's interesting. But just watching I feel like he didn't change all that much, right? I felt like Colette also. I remember, and I don't know Claire, but I remember she attracted some controversy for being like pro-vaccine at a time when like that entire community, with the exception of like her and Sam,
She
had
had
gone.
to go private, right? She had to go. No, she actually left Twitter for a while.
I mean, what a weird thing for to have happened just because of a point of view and a supposedly sort of free thinking community that finds itself on free thinking. So I do think see that um, that so meanwhile, some of the ones who became the most I would say conspiracy addled. Maybe that's not charitable and neutral, but since they said a lot of stuff about me, I feel like I'm entitled. And in that space,
Professional, you call it whatever you like, right?
like with like 1 million followers all of a sudden, I was like, man, this is crazy. As I recall, like at least one of them was saying we were all going to drop dead, right? If you're vaccinated, you're going to drop dead. There were going to be mass casualty events, and there's been no like accountability from the audience for some of those claims. It's just wild how as long as you're saying the thing your audience wants to hear, they're never going to come back to you and say, remember you said that millions of people were going to drop dead? That never happened.
There's
Why?
something about the destabilizing people's trust in each other and society that I mean, this is what Adam Curtis's Hypernormalization, which I think is his best documentary, is about. Basically, he, shows the recent history of Russia as the story of destabilizing people's basically epistemological skills and disorienting them. And, I mean, I was born during the last years of the East Bloc, in the East Bloc. I grew up in the 90s and have very strong memories of the legacy of a morally disoriented world, which is every dictatorship, right? So what dictatorships basically do with you, and this is why a lot of movies and when the Americans are and the English are trying to understand dictatorships, you kind of get it wrong because you don't have an experience of this visceral thing where there's no right and wrong, right? The Handmaid's Tale or the Chernobyl TV series, they are incorrect, because the tragedy of an abusive relationship that is a dictatorship is that it makes you an accomplice in a way and makes all of your relationships tainted, and your morality and your work and your vocation and your beliefs and your optimism. And so I just feel like if we do the same thing, but not with morality, but with epistemology, with not ever knowing what is real, I can't see how that wouldn't have an extremely lasting negative consequence on how we just coexist on this earth. And we are all we have, right? Like, if we don't figure it out, nobody will. There's no parent figure, sadly, who will come. And we've already got the stone tablets. We know not to fuck with each other too much if we want to live in the same village. But there seem to be no new rules unless we make them up. So I just wanted to just voice my worry there. I'm going to go to Ravi first and then back to Jesse, if that's okay, just to ensure that everybody gets a moment on the stage. Ravi.
Yeah.
Ravi was hanging out with us very recently in DC. So it's good to see you again.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, interesting discussion so far. I was curious about whether you had an idea about like the primary nodes of conspiracy type thinking or disinformation. What are the different kind of ways that they can be interested in propagating that? By which I mean, I can think of several categories. There's people who are actively subverting different power centers, but there's also kind of true believers. Then there are some people that are kind of corrupted by the algorithm or by payoffs of different kinds. So I was wondering if you could speak to, yeah, the different motivations or ways that those factors intersect.
Can I just say that Corrupted by the Algorithm would be an amazing, like, alternative electro rock navel gazing album title. Like, if Chet Faker came out with Corrupted by the Algorithm tomorrow, I would just immediately download that. Just, if Chet Faker, if you're watching this needs to happen.
In the book, I was trying to figure out how do I differentiate between like different degrees of some of the stuff. I made a little like influencer taxonomy to try to, not a taxonomy in the sense that there was like a menagerie, I think was the word I wound up going with, because I couldn't think of a taxonomy that was like defensible. It was more of like a, you know it when you see it, how do you describe the characters? And so there are you know, some of them are kind of like take on a very like guru style approach, and the followers will often gravitate to them because they're really looking for guidance, right? They don't actually know how to live their life. They feel very conflicted. They're not really sure of what is true and what is false, and so they find this person, they begin to trust them, and it becomes like a very like a secular guru kind of experience. You see this a lot in wellness spaces, and also that feeling of being unmoored, I think, makes people willing to, you know, to as Anna was noting, that nothing is true and everything is possible feeling. So they'll sort of like attach to one, find a supportive community, and then that supportive community really gives them what they're looking for. You see this a lot with the more cult-like conspiracy communities like QAnon, where they sadly quite directly like alienate their non-believing friends and family, and so they become increasingly isolated, and so then the only thing that they really have left is the community that they're, you know, the QAnon community. But it also simultaneously feels fairly satisfying because there's like some new, you know, I mean, the riddles have stopped, right? There's not been any Q drops in a long time now, but that question of like, how do you interpret world events? How do you connect the dots? How do you like feel like you have some kind of secret knowledge? That I think is very fulfilling for people. You get people who are more just on the run-of-the-mill activist sense, right? Who just really want to they just really want their guy to win, whoever that, or gal to win. And so you see that that becomes a big motivator for some people. But I think it's this combination of, one, like, how do you find community, and two, how do you find entertainment? And there's different motivating factors, you know, that's kind of intersect within those. And, you know, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's a way of determining like what people are looking for, what they're getting out of an online interaction. I think it's important to understand that too. It's not a matter of like what the content is. There's a lot of work that's been done in psychology over the years that suggests that people who believe one conspiracy theory are very likely to believe another. People who are very much extreme in one direction are more likely to go very more, extreme in the opposite direction than just to go become a moderate, because it's like a particular set of personality traits and beliefs that are shaping how they choose to engage.
But do you think that having spent basically the past 25 years on the internet as the human community, or if you're younger, your entire life, do you think that we have better or worse epistemological skills in general than we had 25 years ago?
It's an interesting question. I feel like there's more information than ever before. I think where people are getting lost is that that consensus forming. It's not so much that. So first, it is hard for people to discern good versus bad information sometimes, right? I think source is maybe the easiest heuristic, but there is a lot of fighting now. As people kind of originally treated the epistemological problem as just like, oh, we just need better facts, right? If we just tell people that these are the good facts, then they'll listen to the good facts. And so you see a rise of like fact-checking organizations and then rating organizations where they'll make a list of like, this is a good source, this is a bad source, or high quality and low quality, I think are the terms that you would see. Then there were shifts that just tried to say, okay, we're just gonna talk about this as being a liberal source, leftist source, MAGA source, conservative source, and there would be this more like trying to lay them out on a spectrum. And I think ultimately where I come down is a lot of the issues are that the like trust in those like the processes might be the same. People believe that they're going and searching for information. They believe that they're going and consulting multiple sources. It's just this foundational difference in how do you decide what you trust and who you trust. And that I think is, so more a crisis of trust, I think, than people needing to be taught to check multiple websites at this point.
There used to be this theory that maybe it's John Haidt. I think it was through him that I heard about this years ago, that kind of posited that people would treat misinformation and the whole vibe of social media with a kind of immunization, the way that, we all got addicted to fast food when it first happened. And then after an adjustment period, we would just somehow chill out and learn that we have to eat avocados and quinoa and not, I don't know, In-N-Out burger unless we're extremely high. But the same way as you mentioned, this landmark study that showed that actually if you show people the other side's opinion, they get more radicalized than not. I feel that also is becoming a little bit debunked, right? The same way as people's nutrition has not been really resolved. Maybe the educated classes will eat the avocado and the quinoa, but that's still, just a niche. The same way we feel not to really have been immunized that much. And I'm using the immunity, metaphor here on purpose.
I think that question also of like how many people care about this stuff is also something that comes up more, and I think is worth noting, which is just that we pay a lot of attention to it, especially if you are extremely online, like I am, you are. I don't know, maybe other people on this call too, on this webinar too. I remember watching though. I mean, imagine everybody here saw the the Haitians are eating cats thing that was like viral on the internet for 3-4 days. Before the presidential debates, and then during the presidential debates, President Trump said that thing. They're eating the dogs, they're eating the pets, right? And what was very kind of funny, but evocative of the moment, is that then you see Google search trends spike as all the normal people who are not on the internet are like, what the fuck is he talking about? Right. And they go and they're like Googling, trying to figure out like, what does it mean that they're eating the pets, and like because they just had no concept of it, even though it had like dominated the social media discourse for like 3 or 4 days. And things like moments like that do remind you that even though it occupies like a significant amount of headspace, and people who are on them, on them, I should say, like Twitter and sort of quick chat, text apps are, I don't think, where most Americans are spending their time. So it's sort of interesting to me to see that, that sort of reflection of that in the search data. I saw somebody in the chat asked about DebunkBot. I did see it. It's really interesting. I actually
What? This the same way as I missed out on the baby hippo. You guys have to tell me about this stuff, okay?
So DebunkBot, there was this paper, it was either in Science or Nature, it got a lot of attention, maybe 2 weeks ago now. And what they found was that chatting with this AI chatbot reduced belief in conspiracy theories, and the other kind of effect that that the paper says that they found was what's called durability, which means it stays, right? So it's they see the diminishment, and then that effect persists. I'm very curious about it. I'd like to see more work, sort of more replication of it. They make all the like in the appendix, I think it's the appendix or the supplementary materials, you can access everything. You can access the chat logs, so you can see what people went there for. Very handy kind of drop down menu. You can pick your conspiracy theory, and then you can actually read what these people said. And then you can also talk to it yourself. So I was on mobile. I think, Anna, that I was getting on a plane when I was going through it, and I like didn't, you had to come up with at least, I think, 500 words, if I'm not mistaken, or like some sufficient amount of like meat for the chatbot to work with, and I just didn't feel like coming up with a conspiracy theory and saying I believed it. I didn't 500 words care, basically. And but I read all the logs. I thought the logs were really interesting because you see the bot, it engages very much like ChatGPT does. If you have regular, interactions with ChatGPT, it's like very polite, it's very friendly, it's, got a very kind of like engaging style. This is useful because I think a lot of the times you see conspiracy debunking content is very bland, it's very boring. You're not giving them something else to find entertaining. The other thing is when you give somebody sort of pre-prepared materials, something where you're like, no, here's the debunking sheet on vaccines cause autism. It's not necessarily addressing them personally. And the chatbot, one thing that it can do is it can get at your very specific niche concerns. So when you write your 500 words, maybe you believe that JFK was killed by like Martians for some reason, and you articulate that. And then once it has a sense of your particular version of the conspiracy, it responds with this engaging conversation with the best possible rebuttals, I guess, or persuasive counter content for your arguments. So in that regard, it's interesting because one of the things that's been true for a long time is that the thinking has been that you can radicalize people en masse, sort of mass movements and persuasion. You can take people in one direction, but in order to bring them back, you have to do it individually. Now, this is sort of I don't know, I'm not a psychologist. It does feel a bit contradictory in a way, but the sort of like deprogramming, particularly for people who've been in cult-like communities or in some of the conspiracy theories now are very much, like QAnon, very, very much like that. There's been this sense that you have to engage individually and figure out what that person needs and what brought them to it. And so this idea is that you could maybe scale that by having the AI chatbot do that personalization, because it has like infinite patience and a capacity for personalization. And that's sort of an interesting dynamic. But again, I think
I have Gina here. I think she's still here, who is a psychologist. Oh no, she leave. I think she was traveling. TJ, you have your hand up, and I think Jesse, we also will have time to go back to you if you still remember what you wanted to ask earlier. TG, the floor is yours. And we
Oh,
have
hi.
a question also from Rob in the chat. I will ensure that that gets covered as well.
I'm Tom. Yeah. So I wonder if in the face of like things like DebunkBot, which suggest that there's some effect, and with the extremist sort of reactivity that you were referencing earlier, where it's people seeing what other people are doing in other communities that seems to heighten extremism in some cases, that the solution to some of these things is kind of to see less of each other and to take the human out of it, which is not how I've thought of it, how I've thought of this question at all until this moment. And I guess like one of the things that I'm personally curious about with respects to DebunkBot is I think you know, we're all creatures fallible to things like confirmation bias. We really want to be right. And we also don't want to be publicly wrong in front of someone else. And so even if the DebunkBot was like entirely sort of a mechanical Turk, where it was like someone was actually typing these responses, there's something I think disarming in the process of not being responsible to another human for your beliefs. Does that make sense? And I was wondering if you think there's anything there.
Say a little bit more about that, like not being responsible.
So let's say I have a QAnon belief or something. Let's say whatever, you know, let's say I believe in this thing that and let's say that my family has told me, you know, as often seems to happen for these people, we don't want to hear it anymore, you know, and you are way off in the hinterlands and we don't want to hear this from you anymore. And at some point I encounter DebunkBot, and I'm not arguing with my uncle or my parent or my sister or my, you know, childhood friend anymore. I'm arguing with this disembodied presence that has no existence outside, in a certain sense, outside of the argument. So it has no stakes in the rest of my life. And I lose no face if
Right.
If in listening to the argument, I allow myself to be convinced. And maybe I'm coming there because I want to be convinced after losing my, you know, relationships with my family. And I just think that's yeah, I'm curious what you think about that, whether you think there's anything there about that sort of innate loss, because it's not someone debunking my beliefs anymore. It's kind of like me debunking them with mechanical assistance, you know?
One, right? I mean, it's almost like the therapist model where you have like a non-judgmental person who's helping you through something, but in this case you can abstracted it one more degree past that, because you can ask anything, you can say anything. There's you're not going to get chastised by your chatbot in most cases. So you do see that. I think that it's an interesting motivator. I mean, I think there's that dynamic you're talking about of saving face. I think is very, you know, that rings true. I don't think they've quite sorted out why it works yet. Again, I think they'll have to do more showing that it does work and kind of repeating it a few times. One thing I'll say, I don't know if you read the logs. There were some of them where, have you ever been asked, like, you know, you're given a slider and from like a scale, you're like doing some web survey, and from like 1 to 100, it's like, how do you feel about this? And you know, that the calibration is so ad hoc, at least for me. Maybe other people are not like this, but like, oh yeah, I feel like a 76 today, you know, and a 58 now. Like, what does that even, you know, what does that mean? So there were some things about the I think directionally it's going in the right direction. Some of the claims about X% reduction in belief, I was a bit skeptical of, in part because I also read the chats, and you do see like some of the participants are almost like phoning it in, right? They get the first response, they clearly read it, and then the question that it comes back to them with, do you have more questions? Has this changed your mind? It asks in a couple phases. They had like 3 interactions. So I was a little bit like skeptical when I read some of the responses, which didn't seem like a huge move, and I wondered how they would have calibrated that. So anyway, I mean, I think it's promising. It's got interesting effects. I like that they made it available for anybody to go and try. Maybe if I have 500 words, I'll have Chat GPT write the conspiracy belief cell and like feed it its own adjacent stuff, I guess. But yeah.
Thank
Interesting.
you so much. Rob, I'm going to go to your question now. This is from the chat, Zoom chat. Sorry, what is this? Have you observed any new mechanisms in digital influence campaigns? I would imagine this is since the publication of the book, and as we enter this very novel new era of how to do elections in this country.
Yeah, well, they change constantly. I mean, literally, all the time. And so in that regard, yes, anytime you have a new entrant into the marketplace, meaning like a new platform, you see like we kind of compare it to regulatory arbitrage, right? Like the actor will go and sort of establish an outpost, and we'll see like what that platform has to offer. So TikTok, when bad actors migrated to TikTok, there was like, okay, well, we're gonna use it to make these videos. It's just a different, like they just use things in different ways, and you almost always find them absolutely everywhere. So Truth Social, Parler, Gab, Getter, Telegram, Blue Sky. I don't know how many we've seen on Blue Sky at this point. I think that's still relatively new, or like more niche audiences, but you see them there. And then they're using ChatGPT. OpenAI has kind of been forthcoming about that. I don't know that the most unique stuff I thought was I thought the Iranians did some pretty unique stuff in 2020, where they pretended that they had hacked voter rolls. They spoofed Proud Boys email addresses to send threatening messages to Democrats in order to make Trump supporters look bad. It's just sort of like a constant, steady state of oh, okay, here we are. I guess people did this thing today. So yeah, so it keeps the job in. It's sort of like I say, state actors are not the most impactful voices in the conversation ever. It's always like authentic, domestic, real people in terms of actually reaching the public and having the potential to shape public opinion. But I am always like between state actors and spammers and scammers. I feel like that's really my I like working on those things because people are just so creative. You just see the most when you give somebody a new affordance or a new algorithm to play with, like they really deliver, whether it's for financial motivation or ideological motivation. So so there's always something new.
Being the anthropologist of treachery in this sense must be very surprising daily. Jesse, do you want to go back to your question?
No, but I'll ask a different question.
Oh yeah, did we answer inadvertently your previous question?
Renee, what do you think the line is between entertainment and propaganda?
Woo!
And I say that because at the end, I was kind of thinking about Skibbity Toilet. And is Skibbity Toilet propaganda, or is it entertainment, or is it both? And granted, to your point, it's just creativity, right? But to some young people, it is a kind of propaganda, even though it is clearly entertainment. So where is the line? Like, what is art? Sorry, a little too open-ended, but.
Like this, well, first of all, I don't know that the line's ever been clear, right? There's this book by George Orwell, this essay collection, and the title is All Art is Propaganda. And it's, so there's like a kind of acknowledgement, right? If you're looking to sway someone, if you're looking to move them in a particular direction, not all propaganda is covert, cloak and dagger, disinformation campaign kind of stuff. So, I mean, state actors like America has Voice of America, Iran has Press TV, Russia has RT, each one has their overt, avowed, like, this is the voice of the state, because, governments have their own, like their own capacity to speak. So I think that question of where is the line, some of it is intent, but oftentimes it's challenging to really determine what the intent is, or the people don't actually know. I it is a really, like, when everybody has the capacity to do it, this is the other thing that I try to emphasize in the book, is just like, we all have the capacity to do it now, right? And whether that's making like a weird like YouTube series, or or writing a book, or writing a treatise, or running a network of bots, like, you can kind of choose how you're going to try to be influential in a given conversation. So I think that question of where the line is, I mean, the answer is really, like, maybe unsatisfying. It's very blurry. I think this is pretty common knowledge, right? Like, the CIA was funding various modern artists at various points in time, jazz, right? That question of, how do you think about the power of culture to shape public opinion, sort of soft power in the long run also. So yeah, no, it's a great question. The skibidi toilets thing has been on my, like, have to go down that rabbit hole, and haven't spent much time there, so I can't comment on I mean,
I only bring it up because it from a narrative perspective, it is kind of about propaganda. Like, granted, it's a narrative for kids, but it is infused with the kind of metaphors and memes of our time. And it is a very kind of propaganda-esque narrative. But you do kind of need a tween or younger to kind of watch it with you to help understand, because it's so juvenile that it's difficult for an adult to actually follow.
I have a 10-year-old. I'll ask him. He's my he definitely has, like, I mean, it's funny to see he's like barely online, right? He doesn't have social media. He has Fortnite, where he plays with his friends, and then he has he does watch YouTube, and I feel like YouTube is the way in which all of this kind of makes it in. Like, I definitely hear him saying things where I'm like, how do you know what that is? And then one day I found that kids use Google Docs for live chat. I imagine if you have kids, you know this. Yeah. And he left himself logged in to Google Docs on my computer one day. He was borrowing it to do some homework. He left his laptop at school. And he had this, like, PowerPoint that was the funniest thing. It was like, there was one that was like for memes, and then there was one that was almost like ASMR type stuff, like, swirls and videos that made noise, but just like each slide was like an embedded piece of content, because that's how they get around the YouTube block at school. Turns out Google Docs will render a YouTube link, like, in viewer, so that you can't see it in your browser, you can see it that way. So I'm always struck by, like, the ingenuity and the fact that this was literally like a community shared, like, Google PowerPoint, Google Slides presentation, where they were all throwing this stuff. And also I was like, are you paying attention in class? But yeah.
So cute. Oh my God. But yeah, I remember just from my childhood when we would always figure everything out. Like, you give me one, restriction, and I will find my way around it. We have the first question from Trey. When it comes to digital influence campaigns, is the power not held by the platforms in their algorithmic controls over what specific users see? Not only what they see, but seeing in real time how they interact with it. I've been in and out, so apologies if this was already discussed. No, it wasn't. It's a great question. Thank you, Trey.
Let me pull it up. Sorry. Staring at my little phone here. What are the chat logs that, okay, somebody answered that one. The power is held quite a bit by the platforms. Yeah, sorry, let me shut the chat again. somebody else asked me this once in a chat about the book, and I think it's a reasonable critique, which is like, I describe it as influencers, algorithms, and crowds as like the three sort of forces that come together around this stuff. And somebody said, but don't the platforms have more power because the algorithm is so powerful? I think it's a fair question. Where I've kind of come down on it is like, yes, they have, the algorithm is incredibly powerful because it does that curating, but the algorithm also doesn't have anything to work with if people aren't creating content. And it also, depending on which algorithm we're talking about here, like people you may know has content once you create an account because its job is to be a connector, but a trending algorithm doesn't have content to work with unless users are engaging, and it derives signal from engagement. So there is this interesting kind of multi-part process that happens here. But yes, the way that like the creators are constantly, particularly influencers, responding to the incentives that the platform sets. So I do think that that's kind of up at the top. Once the platform sets the incentive, but you got to keep in mind then, for the platform to set the incentive, it's also trying to keep users there, right? So in a sense, like the crowd does have power in that way by virtue of the platform, sorry, I'm getting this like low power mode warning here, but I think we're 10 minutes, we're good. So I think it is that dynamic of like each of these actors needs the other two to kind of achieve an impact, to have an effect. Let me pull up the question again and just make sure I answered that, because
it's the eternal debate, right? Like, who has the power? And when you, I don't know, enter foreign actors or children into the question, then it becomes even more layered, like who lets whom do what where, and that place is governed by whom. And the answer seems very complicated. And some people are completely subject. We talked about people just having a proclivity to being duped by conspiracy theories. Maybe 200 years ago, they would have been a very happy and satisfied religious person, but today maybe that part in their lives where there is a unifying narrative about the meaning of life is missing, and they will somehow find it. And probably they found it when there was a library available in the village or town, and now they find it online. But who has the power? That's kind of at the core of your book as well. Like, who are there even invisible rulers? I feel like in some cases you are on the fence, because it's kind of, to go back to Scott Alexander, this seems to be like on my mind today. I don't know why. The Moloch, like some shit happens between people as they start the games people play, and mechanisms switch on that might be there without the algorithm as well. We just no longer really see mechanisms without algorithm. That maybe people would have just as easily scapegoated or blamed each other or whatever in a completely non-technical environment. We just happen to no longer have non-technical environments to kind of have the counterfactual there. Like, would this have happened without that? At the same time, we also have the intuition, because of the scale, that, for instance, the Capitol riots probably would not have happened without the internet. Like, to have as many people from that far away. My now late father used to explain to us children, being from Central Europe, where, we got invaded and colonized and we revolted all the time, right? We invented defenestration. You're welcome. Why are there no more revolutions in the United States? And my dad always said that it's because the United States is big. Like, you didn't like it somewhere, you could literally pack up, move 3 days car ride away, in a different climate, even a different language, come a different culture, and start again. And the internet did something to us. And when I was watching the Capitol riots, that's what kind of came back to me, that you can no longer do that. There is a kind of shrinking to our world weirdly through this tool that's supposed to expand it indefinitely. That you can't, like, wherever you are in the US, we lament that there is no monoculture, et cetera, et cetera. There is, it's just, it works very differently. It no longer entails everybody watching the OJ trial, and the whole country stops and generates a $451 million loss because nobody's, flushing a toilet in the country for 5 minutes. But the monoculture is kind of there, that if you live in Portland and if you move to Southern Florida, through your phone, you kind of stay in the same culture. And I think that's kind of new, no?
I think so. I was thinking of, did you read Balaji's Network State?
He gave an internet section about it. It's very interesting. We have a big disagreement about defense.
Yes.
I feel that his states are militarily indefensible, but that's for a different conversation.
It's more like network subcultures, but yeah. I agree. But no, I think yeah, it is. I mean, I think you start to see, like, when you go to like to Blue Sky now, like as you noted, right, the culture becomes clear pretty quickly, and you can decide if you want to stay or not, right? And it's kind of an interesting dynamic now that in the last like 1 year we've started to have that. We started to have this sort of proliferation where people can go and establish themselves, and I think that's encouraging. I'm kind of curious to see how it goes. Maybe we were never meant to all be on the same platform. Maybe that it wasn't quite the same thing as having a shared national identity, it turned out.
I mean, that's what the When Graeber book is about. And I think that's why everybody was talking about the dawn of everything, because it kind of creates this historical narrative where we were never, that it's not true that we used to live 50 of us with our cousins in the same, cave, because they dig up these graves and people are not genetically related to each other. They were choosing their own families and leaving whatever they were born into behind. Maybe that's what we're doing. We're continuing a tradition. Is there something that surprised you since the book came out, and how, just to kind of like, leave us with something uplifting, or give us a homework here, Renée, like what's something that might have surprised you since the book came out, and what's a new mission you're working on?
Like, man, it's too bad the eating the dogs thing didn't happen like when I was still writing it, because that would have been like
I'm an immigrant, and I was like, I'm eating dogs and cats. I didn't know.
It was like, this is the perfect illustration of like what I was trying to get at with this idea of like the rumor mill and the propaganda machine working hand in hand now, and just that like collision where you see it bouncing back and forth between normal people trying to figure out what's true and political elites shaping a narrative in service to political power. So so you do see that. But I think as far as like, so I felt like, okay, good, the thesis continues to be proven. But let's see. I mean, I'm not optimistic. I'm an avid, user of tech. I'm active on social media. I just choose to be a little bit more, I don't know if mindful is the word, but I just choose where I spend my time a little bit more selectively now. I think for people like, you have an incredible amount of power you don't necessarily realize when it comes to where you participate, how you act, like the norms that you shape in your communities, the ways that you can help information move. And I think that people realizing that is one of the things that I kind of hope to accomplish with the book.
It's basically giving us back our self-confidence that the user has a power by choosing. You can actually curate it for yourself, and you don't have to, maybe not on TikTok, but anything that's not TikTok, you probably have more curatorial power than you think. Renée DiResta, thank you so much for being here. Everybody, if you haven't read Invisible Rulers, it's a tough read. It's not the beach read kind of thing. Unless you're like as weird as me and you like to read stuff like this on the beach. But I actually felt weirdly empowered by the end, just by feeling that nobody knows. That gives me some reassurance that we're trying to figure out how to deal with this unprecedented power that these people are yielding, and that we can push back and we can platforms and say, no, that's empowering. Thank you so much for being here, everybody, and for the great questions. We will continue this discussion soon, maybe about child safety at some point in the future. Take good care of yourselves. Good night. Take care. Bye.